History remembers Cleopatra as a seductress draped in gold, a woman who toppled empires with a glance. But that version of her story was written by her enemies, polished by poets, and repeated until it replaced the truth. Behind the myths, behind the scandals, stood a ruler playing the most dangerous political game the ancient world had ever seen. This is not the story of a beautiful queen who relied on charm. This is the story of a strategist raised inside a collapsing dynasty, a woman who learned early that power was never given, only taken and always at a cost. Cleopatra VII Philopator was born into a royal family that had already lost its grip on greatness. By the time she entered the world in 69 BCE, Egypt was no longer the unstoppable civilization that once dictated the rhythm of the Mediterranean. It was rich, ancient, and symbolically powerful, but politically fragile. The Ptolemaic dynasty, descended from one of Alexander the Great's generals, had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, and by Cleopatra's birth it was rotting from the inside out. The palace in Alexandria was filled with luxury, but also paranoia. Intrigue was not an occasional threat, it was daily life. Brothers married sisters not out of romance, but tradition. Poison was a political tool. Exile was a mercy. Murder was often more efficient. Cleopatra grew up watching relatives disappear from court, erased not only from power but from memory. In the Ptolemaic world, survival required intelligence, adaptability, and ruthless awareness. Innocence did not last long. Her father, Ptolemy XVI, was a weak ruler propped up by Roman money and Roman patience. He was mocked by his own people and tolerated by Rome only because Egypt's grain kept the republic fed. When unrest erupted, he fled, abandoning his children and his throne without a fight. Cleopatra was still young, but she witnessed the most important lesson of her life. A crown meant nothing if others believed you were disposable. While other royal children were raised as ceremonial figures, Cleopatra was educated as a future ruler. She studied mathematics, philosophy, astronomy, medicine, and law. Most unusually, she learned languages not just Greek, the language of her dynasty, but Egyptian, the language of her people. This single choice separated her from every Ptolemaic ruler before her. She was not content to rule Egypt from above. She intended to rule it from within. As her father clawed his way back to power with Roman legions behind him, Cleopatra learned another hard truth. Rome was no ally. Rome did not conquer with swords alone. It conquered with debt, obligation, and protection. Egypt was no longer free. It was collateral. Every decision made in Alexandria echoed in the halls of Roman power, and Cleopatra understood that Egypt's future would be decided as much in Rome as on the Nile. When Ptolemy XVI died, Cleopatra was around 18 years old. His will named her co-ruler with her younger brother Ptolemy XIII as tradition demanded. On paper, they were equals. In reality, Cleopatra was the threat. She was older, smarter, and politically aware. The boy king was surrounded by advisors who saw Cleopatra not as a partner, but as an obstacle. Cleopatra moved quickly. Coins were minted with her face alone, a deliberate statement of authority. Official documents placed her name before her brothers. She presented herself not merely as queen, but as the living embodiment of Egypt itself, aligning her image with the goddess Isis. This was not vanity, it was strategy. Cleopatra was crafting legitimacy in a kingdom where tradition and religion mattered as much as armies. The response was swift and brutal. The court turned against her. Advisors whispered that she was too ambitious, too independent, too dangerous. Within 3 years of taking the throne, Cleopatra was forced into exile. The queen of Egypt was reduced to a fugitive, driven from Alexandria, watching her brother's regime consolidate power in her absence. Exile did not break Cleopatra. It refined her. She gathered allies, raised forces, and planned her return with patience that bordered on obsession. She understood that marching back into Alexandria with soldiers alone would fail. Egypt was not won by brute force anymore. It was won by influence, and Rome was the key. At the same time, the Roman world was tearing itself apart. Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great, once allies, were locked in a civil war that would determine the fate of the Republic. Egypt, strategically vital and politically unstable, became a prize neither man could ignore. When Pompey fled to Egypt seeking refuge, he was murdered by Ptolemy XIII's advisors in a disastrous attempt to impress Caesar. Instead, they invited disaster. Caesar arrived in Alexandria not as a guest, but as a judge. He summoned the royal siblings to settle their dispute under Roman authority. Ptolemy XIII came backed by an army. Cleopatra came with something far more dangerous, a plan. She returned to Alexandria in secret, slipping past guards and enemies alike. This was not a romantic gesture or a reckless gamble. It was the calculated move of a woman who understood theater, psychology, and timing. Cleopatra did not intend to beg for her throne. She intended to redefine the balance of power in the Eastern Mediterranean. As she prepared to step back into the city that had cast her out, Cleopatra knew the stakes had never been higher. If she failed, she would not be exiled again. She would be erased. But if she succeeded, she would no longer be just Queen of Egypt. She would become a player on Rome's stage. shaping the future of empires far larger than her own. And with that realization, Cleopatra's true story was only beginning. Cleopatra did not return to Alexandria like a defeated ruler seeking mercy. She returned like a strategist entering enemy territory, fully aware that one mistake would mean death. The city that once celebrated her name now belonged to her enemies, ruled by her younger brother's court and guarded by soldiers loyal to advisors who wanted her erased. Every street, every palace corridor, every dock along the harbor carried the risk of betrayal. Yet Cleopatra understood something her rivals did not. Power in Alexandria no longer rested solely in Egyptian hands. Julius Caesar had arrived in the city as both conqueror and mediator, backed by Roman authority and Roman arrogance. He came to Egypt to settle unfinished business from Rome's civil war, to secure grain supplies, and remind client kingdoms who truly controlled the Mediterranean. He did not come seeking romance, alliance, or admiration. He came expecting obedience. Cleopatra intended to change that expectation. Smuggled into the city under cover of darkness, she made her way to the royal palace, not with an army, but with audacity. Her entrance was not dramatic by accident. It was calculated, theater designed to disrupt Caesar's assumptions. Cleopatra did not present herself as a desperate exile or a decorative monarch. She presented herself as the rightful ruler of Egypt, calm, composed, and fully aware of Rome's dependence on her land. Caesar quickly realized that Egypt's crisis was far more dangerous than his advisors had warned. The murder of Pompey had offended Roman custom. The rivalry between the siblings threatened to ignite a full-scale war in a city that Rome could not afford to lose. Cleopatra, however, offered something else: stability, legitimacy, and cooperation on her terms. She framed the conflict not as a family dispute, but as a question of lawful succession. Her argument was simple and lethal. Egypt functioned best under her rule. Rome benefited most from a stable Egypt. Removing her would guarantee chaos. Supporting her would ensure loyalty. Cleopatra did not flatter Caesar. She negotiated with him, placing herself not beneath Rome, but beside it. This alone shifted the balance of power. Ptolemy XIII and his advisors underestimated the situation. They believed Caesar could be managed, bribed, or intimidated. Instead, Caesar declared that the siblings would rule together, restoring Cleopatra's position and undermining the boy king's authority. Alexandria erupted in tension. Crowds turned hostile. Soldiers chose sides. What began as a political maneuver spiraled into open conflict. The Alexandrian War was not a clash of empires, it was a battle of survival. Caesar found himself besieged inside the city, outnumbered and surrounded. Cleopatra, once again, stood at the center of the storm. To her enemies, she was a foreign-backed traitor. To Rome, she was both a risk and an asset. To Egypt, she was a symbol of resistance or ruin, depending on who was asked. As fighting consumed the streets, Cleopatra's position remained precarious. Her brother's forces controlled much of the city. Fires spread through the harbor, destroying ships and warehouses. The famed Library of Alexandria suffered damage and unintended casualty of political ambition. Egypt's intellectual heart burned while its future hung in the balance. Cleopatra did not retreat. She stayed close to Caesar, advising him on Egyptian politics, geography, and alliances. She leveraged her knowledge of local factions, religious authority, and regional loyalties. This was not the behavior of a consort. It was the work of a ruler reclaiming her state through calculated partnership. When reinforcements finally arrived for Caesar, the tide turned. Ptolemy XIII attempted to flee but drowned during the retreat, his crown lost to the river that had sustained Egypt for millennia. His death was not tragic in Cleopatra's eyes, it was inevitable. In the Ptolemaic dynasty, weakness was a death sentence, and hesitation was fatal. With her brother gone, Cleopatra was restored to the throne. Another younger brother was named co-ruler to satisfy tradition, but real power rested firmly with her. Egypt, exhausted by conflict, accepted her rule. Rome, pragmatic as ever, recognized her authority. Cleopatra had achieved what few rulers ever did. She survived exile, defeated her rivals, and bound the fate of her kingdom to the most powerful man in the world without surrendering control. But victory carried consequences. Cleopatra's alliance with Caesar reshaped how the world saw her. Roman elites whispered that she was dangerous, manipulative, and ambitious. These narratives did not emerge from scandal. They emerged from fear. Cleopatra had demonstrated that Egypt was not a passive province waiting to be absorbed. It was a sovereign power led by a woman who understood Rome as well as Rome understood itself. When Cleopatra later traveled to Rome, she did not arrive as a subordinate queen. She arrived as an equal, displaying Egypt's wealth openly, asserting her status, and reminding Rome that its prosperity depended on her land. Caesar acknowledged her publicly, an act that sent shockwaves through Roman politics and further inflamed opposition against him. Cleopatra's position was stronger than ever, but also more dangerous. Her fate was now inseparable from Caesar's. If he fell, her protection vanished. If Rome turned against him, Egypt would once again become vulnerable. Cleopatra had secured her throne, but she had tied it to a man standing at the center of Rome's most volatile moment. As tension in Rome escalated and enemies closed in around Caesar, Cleopatra watched carefully, knowing history was shifting beneath her feet. She had won a kingdom, but the price of that victory had not yet been paid. And when the knives finally came out in Rome, Cleopatra would discover that surviving Egypt's palace politics had only prepared her for a far deadlier game.